Thank you, guys. You know, I love music. And one of these days, when it's all over here on this earth, I'll be able to play music. As I was sitting there, I'm going to share something that's not in this message this morning. As I was sitting there, I was thinking about the times in Salt Lake City when I was working for the Lord, and I had a prison ministry going. So they had asked me to have the sermon at the prison ministry. I said, sure, man, I can do that. So I go out there and stood up at the chapel now in a pulpit. They put me in a room with all these, well, by God's grace, I'm not there probably, I say criminals, but they're all around me, in front and behind and all around. And so there I'm sitting there with a Bible full of notes. And these guys are sitting here and they're sitting there. And I think, man, I can't bring these notes out here. These guys will. So I started a brand new sermon. When I went out of there, I was just perspired from head to foot. So. It was 1909, and it was in Atlanta, Kansas. And a young lady by the name of Doris was in the hospital there, and she gave birth to a little baby boy. So her and her husband, Clint, they named this little guy, they named him Glenn. He was like any little boy. In fact, last night I was reading, dealing with children in the Science magazine that talked about the terrible twos. Well, this guy, he was like a terrible two. He was everywhere. And one thing the parents noticed about this little guy was that everywhere he went, he had to run. He was running, always running. Run to the table, run to the bathroom. He was outside. He was always running. And so as time passed, and as he got a little older, he and his brother Floyd, they had the responsibility to go to the school there in Sunflower County, the little county school they went to. And it was their job to stoke this big potbelly stove, throw the wood in there. So as usual, Floyd and Glenn, they went out the door, and it was a race to the finish as to who was going to get to the school the first. His brother was older, and it was so close so many times. Anyway, they're in school. They filled this thing full of wood, so they splashed some kerosene in there, which is not all that dangerous because it's not that volatile. The only thing they didn't realize was that the fuel man had stopped by that morning, and he had left gasoline instead of kerosene. So they throw a liberal amount of gasoline in there, and Floyd strikes a match and throws it in, and there was a huge explosion, and the school burned down. And these two little guys, they both got burned just terrible. Floyd died a couple of weeks later of his burns, and Glenn was in the hospital for weeks. And the doctors counseled the parents, and they said, we should amputate his legs because he's never going to walk again. All the skin was burned off his knees and his shins, and lost all the toes on his left foot. Just terribly burned. And the mother said, no, you're not doing that. We are not having that. Absolutely not. So the doctor said, well, he might get an infection and he'll never walk again. So they took him home, and as the weeks passed, this little guy, he started moving his legs a little bit, and they were so gnarly, and he would ask his mother to massage them. He wanted to walk again, and massaging them. And one day he was standing by the end of the bed, and one of his friends come walking in from school, a school chum, and they were talking, and so the lad said to him, you know what, Glenn? He says, you're never going to walk again. And it was right there in his autobiography that he decided that not only was he going to walk, but he was going to run. So he sort of hobbled around and started walking, and his mom would massage his legs, and he'd say, more, Mom, harder, harder, harder. You might have heard this story, or I don't know. But anyway, he started walking, and pretty soon he was running, and by the time he was 12 years old, years had passed, he was running pretty good. In fact, as the school had a track day that particular day, and as he was out there for this track day, not only did he win in his age group, but he beat the whole school. He set records. And as he went off to college, no matter where he went, he was always winning, setting new records. And always attributed that when he was not going to give up. In fact, as he was so good that they decided that they would have Glenn represent the United States in the Olympics from a kid that was never going to walk again. and he won a silver medal. And you know, the Olympics, the original modern one, was 1896. It was there in Athens, Greece. And so that was the start of the modern Olympics. But it actually goes back some 3,000 years to a little town in Greece. It was called Olympia, there on the Peloponnese Peninsula. And this little town was dedicated to Zeus. It was a sanctuary. So they would have these Olympic Games every 4 years in honor of Zeus. So that's how the Olympics actually got started. And Paul, in his epistles, several times in his epistles, he referred to games, to racing, to fighting, to boxing. And he related that to like the warfare that we're in as we struggle through life, as we're trying to get the victory over. In fact, it is in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, he said, don't you know that when there's a race, everybody runs, but only one person receives the prize? And as he's talking to his Christian brothers and sisters, he said, now you run like you're going to obtain the prize. And then he said, every man that strives for the mastery, he's temperate in all things. So when he's out practicing for it, he's temperate in all things. He said they do it to obtain a what? Corruptible crown. And we do it to obtain an incorruptible crown. And he says, this is Paul, he says, therefore, when I run, I don't do it uncertainly, that's what he says, but in other words, he's not out there running in circles. He's running for the goal. So therefore, when I run, I don't run uncertainly. And when I fight, I'm not beating the air or, you know, when you box, sort of shadow box, going for the body blows. And he says, I discipline my body. I bring it into subjection, that when I have run the race, that I myself will not be a castaway. In the book of Hebrews 12, it tells us that this race that we're in is like a race in the amphitheaters there. It's in the book of Hebrews 12. Turn with me there if you would. Hebrews 12th chapter, verse 1. We lay aside every weight. 12:1. Oh yeah. It says, therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great cloud of witnesses. Now this great cloud of witnesses, these are the heroes that's mentioned in the previous chapter, the faith chapter. Great cloud of witnesses. Let us lay aside every weight. Well, what they did back in the Olympics, what they would do, they would put weights on their feet, have shoes that were made out of lead, I guess. You've heard that expression. Had this little halter, they put weights in that, put weights on their arms. So now they're running and practicing for the Olympics, you know, like they was weighted down all the time. But then when it came time for the race, they laid aside every weight, and it was like they were running on air. You ever done that, John? Never done, okay. John's a marathon runner. Every weight that sin which so easily ensnares us, we're to lay that aside too. And let us run with endurance. So he's talking about races, but he's actually making the analogy that it's the Christian race that we run. Run with endurance, this race that is set before us. Paul not only uses the races and the Olympic Games, but he uses warfare. We're all familiar with that verse in Ephesians 6 where it says, put on the whole armor of God, you know, so that you can fight that fight and stand there. And it's a battle. And so as we have this armor of God, we're protected. You know, when our soldiers, when they go out into the battlefield, you know, they're not out there in flip-flops and a T-shirt. You know, they're out there with combat boots, fatigues, and infrared, not infrared lights, but these lights sensitive to seeing in the dark. They have helmets on to protect them from the bullets. And so we have this same type of warfare going on in the spiritual realm. And so we can quench the fiery darts of the evil one. Here probably, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had Brian McMahon when he gave the message to us and sort of showed where we are and what's going on. Sort of like John. He used 2 Timothy 3, and then John, he used 2 Timothy 3, and it was embedded in my message to use 2 Timothy 3. So let's read 2 Timothy 3 for the third time now. God has a message in that one for us. It's in 2 Timothy, the third chapter. It says, "No, in these last days perilous times will come." It's in 2 Timothy, the third chapter. And it says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come." Now, as we read this, sort of visualize, if you would, just in your mind's eye, that we're talking about the time we're living in right now, okay? With everything that's going on in America, that's going on all over the world, in Russia and China, just sort of visualize all these different things that are happening. And what he says, that in the last days perilous times will come. All you got to think about is over there in Portland, Oregon, what went on for days and months. "For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, they're proud, they're blasphemers, they're disobedient to parents, they're unthankful, they're unholy." What a lot. "Unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good." Remember now, we're sort of visualizing what's going on around us. "Traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God." And it says, these, they have a form of godliness, but they deny the power. In other words, they look like Christians, but they don't ask for the power to be victorious over sin. I was listening to a message one time by Chuck Swindoll, and he was talking about several things. One is, in the morning when you get up, read the good news before you read the bad news. But he also said that they did a survey across the board, people that go to church, Christians, and those that don't go to church. They all ate alike, they all drank alike, they all watched the same movies on TV, they went to the same theater, they went out and ate. The only difference between these two groups and what they did in life was that one group went to church. Nothing in the life that would set them apart, but they all were just exactly alike. You know, when you read the biography of some of these athletes that have competed and have run for the gold, the one thing they have in common, what's the one thing that all athletes have in common? They're really going for it. They are focused. I mean, they know exactly where they're going. They know exactly what it's all about. They're in for the long haul, you know. And kids, when you look at these races and these championships, a lot of them, they start out as kids at a young age, just a young age, you know. And they deny themselves the pleasures. They're not out there, you know, he's over there running. Well, I guess I better run a little bit. They're not out there eating pizza at night. You know? John, you didn't know you was part of the sermon there. When you were competing in these races, and you were in training, out there just beating your body into subjection, when you would go home sometimes you think, man, it has been such a grueling day. You know, I think I'm going to take a rest tonight. And did you ever lay up on your couch and eat Captain Crunch and watch Captain Kangaroo on and say, I think I'll watch a little. No, I mean, diligent, persevering, denying themselves. And Paul was talking how that they were bringing their bodies into subjection for the task that was in front of them. And as they focused, they were focusing on this one moment. When you were running, were you focusing on second place? No, first place. Standing on the podium, head and shoulders above everybody, putting that gold around your neck, putting that little wreath on your head, you know. You got the silver and you got the bronze, but hey, man, I got the gold. For that one glorious moment, to receive that crown that fades away. And the race that you and I are in, you know, it's a race like Paul talks about, but it's It's a race for life. No, we don't look at it like it's a race for life, but it's deadly serious. Every day we run this race. And the irony of it is whether we like it or not, we're in this race to the end. And it depends on how we run this race as to where we go, whether we end up with the crown of life or the crown that fades away. You know, we've always got that lion nipping at our heels, just always there. In Matthew, the 24th chapter, Christ talking about the end of time when the lawlessness would abound and the love of many would grow cold. And then he says, he that endures to the end, he's the one that's going to be saved. He is the one that's going to receive that crown of glory. And John the Revelator says the same thing in Revelation 2. He says, to he that overcomes, or he that endures to the end, will I give him the right to eat of the tree of life in the midst of the garden, which is where God is. So now the race we're in is not a 100-yard dash. It's not a 10-mile marathon. It's a grueling race. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this. In Hawaii, they have the official Ironman triathlon. Has anybody ever heard of that? Yeah. I mean, it is incredible. It's held there on the island of Kona, Hawaii. It's a series of long-distance runs, triathlon events. And you just don't buy a ticket. You say, I think I'm doing pretty good, man. I think I'm going to go join that Ironman triathlon. That's not how it works. Throughout the world, there's 27 different countries that hold these Ironman triathlons to select those who are going to go to the big one in Hawaii. And you don't just run one, you run 12 of them, or 13, and you're selected by your endurance and how you perform the race. There are like 100,000 people a year vying for a position so they can go to Hawaii and run this race, this triathlon. So, not that many make it. You know, and the training is just unbelievable. It's like, well, John well knows the training is like 13, 14, 30 hours a week, depends on how driven you are to get the prize. And what's interesting about this triathlon Ironman endurance race in Hawaii is that you've got 17 hours to finish the race. Can you imagine running all these different things you do for 17 hours, nonstop? Starts at 7 in the morning,